Uh, an error could go live. All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in. I am really excited. We have an awesome guest today, Dr. Jonathan Kendall, and he wrote a fantastic book we're going to be talking about, and it's called Seeing the Messiah. I would highly recommend everybody get this book and read it. If you have any interest in the supernatural and angels, demons, even anything that in the spiritual realm, this is a good place to go. This is a good place to start and to be reading. And I'm going to have Jonathan introduce himself, a little bit of his background, because he's not a theologian the way that Mike Lincona is, and yet he still wrote what I would consider a scholarly work, really well researched across the board. Feel free, as always, to put your comments or questions in the chat. I will be looking through them as always, and if there's a good one that makes sense, I'll bring it up. But Jonathan, we're excited that you're here. Could you just give us a little bit of a background? As I mentioned, you're not a theologian, and yet you still decided to write a really interesting book.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and thanks for that introduction. It's probably better than I deserve. But yeah, just to give a little bit of a background on me, I'm a medical doctor, nephrologist. That's a doctor of the kidneys. But ever since kind of the end of my undergraduate run at University of Kentucky and on into medical school, I took an interest in Christian apologetics. So I had done a lot of reading on that over the years. What got me interested in this specific subject was Dale Allison in 2005 wrote a book on the resurrection of Jesus, or the last half of the book it was called Resurrecting Jesus. And then in 2021, he wrote a full-length book on it. That's, I think, one of the larger books out there that's been written. And he talks about apparitions. And as I went through it, I thought, wow, this actually has a lot more explanatory power to explain potentially Jesus' resurrection appearances than your typical alternative theories would, like the hallucination theory, the swoon theory, the fraud theory, and so forth. So I really wanted to take a look at this because I don't think there's much out there on it. I also have to give an assist to Jake O'Connell, who wrote a really good book in 2017 on apparitions. So I thought I'd add to the conversation here. That was the goal.
I love that. And I will link your book in the description below. And I'll also add a couple of other books that I think if this is interesting for anybody watching, you're going to want to not only read Seeing the Messiah, but there's a great book by Richard Gallagher. Lee Strobel came out with a new book. There's a lot of interest in this area. So I think the first question is baseline. When you're saying apparition, what are you talking about?
Well, I think we might be talking about multiple things, but typically when you hear the word apparition, you think ghost, you think maybe haunted house, you think seeing the spirit of somebody that happens to be there, that is there in spirit and not in body. That, I think, that would be the absolute minimal baseline. Now, how that occurs, I think, is more complex. I don't think in most cases they're actual spirits of the dead.
And we're going to get into that because I think that part of what I found very interesting about your book is that it wasn't until the very end, probably maybe chapter 17, 18, 19, that you even really started referencing or even asking questions about angels, demons, and so on. Otherwise, it was pretty much apparition the whole way. So we're going to have to dig into that. But at the highest level, you just said you don't think a lot of these apparitions are necessarily ghosts, if we're using the most generic, or a spirit.
Yes.
So why do you say that?
Gosh, well, the evidence, you have to go back to the late 19th, early 20th century. This is a lot of the material that Dale Allison drew on, and I did as well, as did Jake O'Connell when he wrote his books. The Society for Psychical Research. This was a bunch of scholars from Cambridge. They got together and they said, we want to know about this. We looked at the paranormal. They looked at mediums. They looked at other kinds of things that were even then kind of outside the mainstream. because we're steeped in the world of scientific materialism. So that kind of stuff was anathema then, just like it is now. But they really did serious research. They did firsthand or interviews with firsthand witnesses, and they, over the years, they came up with tens of thousands of pages of material that was very well evidenced. And it really leaves you no doubt that this phenomenon is real. So, and getting back to the question, I think, and this requires a little bit of unpacking, but I think telepathy is probably the primary mechanism by how this happens. That is mind-to-mind communication.
Absolutely. And part of that mind-to-mind communication, which is I would guess after reading your book, you'd probably agree is difficult for anybody to believe or even ascertain. Is we have this thing, this entity that's disembodied, so we don't see it. So if you have a materialistic view of the world, or a materialist view of the world, you're not seeing this thing, or not seeing it the way that you and I see each other right now, or if we're in the same room. And then we're also dealing with this idea that something is being downloaded or imputed into you. You're not even hearing it. And yet now all of a sudden you're receiving information. Now all of a sudden you're receiving likely unknown information, and something that wouldn't easily be replicated or fraudulently discovered.
Right. Yeah. So you really have to have a background into what we call psi. That's based on the Greek letter psi, PSI, which is just code for essentially paranormal activity, telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, psychokinesis or telekinesis, that is mind influencing matter from a distance. Then you get into other things like precognition, which is having a glimpse into the future, or retrocognition, having a supernormal glance at something that happened in the past. Now, when people hear about this, especially in the West, you think people's eyes glaze over. Mine would have about 5 or 6 years ago too. I'd have said, well, this is just pseudoscience. It's something you can't take seriously. And yet, if you go into the seminal works of the Society for Psychical Research, especially the Census on Hallucinations, the Phantasms of the Living, Frederick W.H. Meyer's work, Human Personality, the evidence for these things is immense. And that was really an eye-opener for me. I had no idea this literature existed, that there were people that took this seriously, much less that they were able to amass what is just an overwhelming amount of data that these things do, in fact, occur in nature.
What is astounding about this entire discipline is, as a Bible-believing Christian, there is no doubt that angels and demons are spoken about innumerably well, I guess technically you could count it, but we'll just say big hyperbolic, innumerably in the Bible. In fact, like 26 out of 27 of the books of the New Testament talk about Satan or talk about demons. So that it's there, right? And yet we have, I feel like in the church today, why we either have what C.S. Lewis talked about, either an obsession with everything is demons, everything is an apparition, everything is Satan, or nothing. Or we take a totally materialist mindset toward this. So through your book, I can see that you are a believer. So how did you manage that to try to get information that is useful for people to understand, and at the same point in time don't fall on, I mean, obviously once you started to see, yeah, no, this is real, but then not become obsessed where every sickness is a demon or an apparition, every scenario that is not immediately apparent, oh, it must be a demon, it must be an angel. How did you even work through that?
I guess it's the scientific mindset in me. If you're a medical doctor, you have to go into these things as a way of scrutinizing the data and coming up with the best explanation. So you're right. We have some people saying, well, the devil hid my car keys and things like that, which of course that's going way too far in the other direction. But what's important too, in the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, those researchers knew this as well. The majority of these cases probably have mundane explanations. They can be explained through hallucinations, which are subjective. When I talk about apparitions, I'm talking about things that are objective. There are fraudulent cases, probably a small percentage, but there are fraudulent cases out there. So you really, anytime you run across a given case, and it has to be a case by case basis, you just say, okay, do your typical mundane prosaic explanations, will they suffice to account for this? What do we think? And sometimes there's no way to know that for sure, but just like with the resurrection appearances of Jesus, you weigh the different hypotheses. You have to favor the more mundane ones because mundane occurs more often than paranormal or supernatural. But if all that's left is a paranormal explanation or a supernatural one, then I think it's reasonable to go that far. That's where we separate from our philosophers and scientists that are steeped in materialism.
So for you, because you used a blanket term of apparition, and sometimes you used specter and other sorts of nomenclature like that. Would you be willing to say that there are angels, there are demons, and that is an explanation for any of the cases that you referenced? And we'll set aside Jesus' resurrection, and even I think the Lubavitcher Rebbe is interesting as well. But would you be willing to say of the cases you cited or what you've read that this looks like this rescue apparition, this looks like an angel, or this haunting apparition, this looks like a demon?
Yeah, I do believe that some apparitions can be explained through religious figures, angels, demons. I do believe some apparitions are conscious preternatural enemies, and I believe some are actually the deceased appearing as well. I think there's multiple mechanisms, probably at least three, that exist for how an apparition is going to occur, and I think one of them is, yes, you're actually seeing something that is conscious.
And what would the other two be?
The other ones would be telepathy, and really, chapter 3 is where I unpack this, I think, the best. It makes the most sense. That's apparitions of the living. You've got situations where, and in some cases, deliberately, they had experiments where one psychical researcher, without another person knowing, they would try to actually project an apparition, usually of themselves, to one or two people, unbeknownst to the percipients, and it would actually work. They would run into these people the other night and said, the other night I saw you by my bedside. Yeah, and again, these were very well researched, very serious people that were doing it, and in the case of the person that projected the apparition, the agent, that person doesn't consciously remember being at the bedside. All that person remembers is actually trying to make the apparition occur to these percipients. So I think that was mind-to-mind communication. Somehow the agent connected with the percipient in a telepathic way. The subconscious mind of the receiver, the percipient, received it, and it went through the subconscious mind of that person or people that happened to be present, and they projected an apparition. And sometimes it looks different than what the agent actually projects. The other one would be, and I think this other one is rarer, but the other one would be psychokinesis, where you have mind control on matter, and cases where people actually get together, like in a seance, and try to produce apparitions. Sometimes those tend to be seen by everybody present, even when there's dozens of people. You don't see spontaneous apparitions appear to that many people. And just about everybody present tends to see it in most cases, and they can be touched. They just appear in ways that are just much more dramatic, much more overt than what you see in spontaneous cases. So I think in those cases, you probably have something that is materially there, at least for a short period of time.
So, how do you reconcile, either personally or for any other believers watching, how do you reconcile this idea of the dead, as you said, the deceased, with the complete explicit prohibition of necromancy that we see in Deuteronomy 18, Leviticus 19? I mean, it's pretty clear we're not to commune with the dead. So how do you reconcile this with your categories, and a lot of times it seems like this is not necessarily outside of a seance, a Ouija board, one of those scenarios. People aren't people aren't going, man, I hope my deceased wife shows up and rubs me on the face until she chokes me, although it was the husband and the wife in your example. I mean, how do you handle that as a believer, or how have you reconciled that personally?
Most cases I think are telepathy, and so in those cases that's just two people essentially generating an apparition. So that wouldn't really be a cult. I guess it could be if you try to do it intentionally. As far as the cases where I believe it's actually a deceased person appearing in spirit, I would say it's not good to desire that. I don't think you should pray for that happening. I was just listening to Sean McDowell interview an author who talks about this kind of stuff, and where people have asked God for a dead loved one, like a spouse, to appear, and it might have felt good at first, and then it turned into something very different, something much more sinister later. Yeah, I don't think it's good to want to thin that veil, because you just don't know what's going to walk through. So that being said, in cases that are spontaneous, if God wants to present a spirit to a person, or a sense of presence, it's not always an apparition. I don't see why that necessarily goes against the Bible, but I don't think that we should desire it, or ask for it, and I don't think that we should try to facilitate it like in a seance. I think you're asking for trouble if you do that.
Well, I think hearing what you're saying and after reading your book, I would say there may even be a category error if people think there is an apparition that appears, and again, you talked about this could be telepathy. I think there could be a case you made about super psi, and how this could be facilitating that as well. That seems to be very unconscious. That seems to be outside of any specific agenda. Whereas a seance, where you are looking to intentionally commune, this seems like it's a different world. This seems where we do start to get into the demonic, where we're, at least from my amateur perspective, it seems like we're in two different categories.
No, I agree completely. Some people have these and it's just completely spontaneous. And I would just say, look, Lord, I can't help it that an apparition appeared to me spontaneously. I didn't ask for this. I didn't try to facilitate it. So I have to think that that's completely innocent. And as it turns out, most people that have these, especially bereavement apparitions, you lose a loved one, especially a spouse, but it doesn't have to be a spouse. It could be a child, or a mother, or a father. And it's, with rare exceptions, at least in the West, it's very comforting to the percipient. So, yeah, I think I agree. I think those are two very different categories. But if you look into the literature on seances, things like that, even some of the literature that I've read, which is more neutral, where they don't try to, the SPR folks, for instance, they don't try to invoke preternatural entities or supernatural entities. They don't bring God or the devil into it. They just look at the facts and try to say, well, how do we best interpret this as a matter of science, as a matter of philosophy. But even in some of their cases, you read about some things that have happened that they're very disturbing. Yeah, the irony is, some people that read this information and have researched it like I have might have more interest in the occult. For me, it's the opposite. I don't want any part of it. In fact, I really don't want to see an apparition. I don't want anything supernatural or paranormal occurring to me. I'm immensely fascinated by this, but I prefer to see it from a distance and read about it and study it.
Amen. And maybe I wouldn't mind a miracle. If God wanted to deliver a miracle, that would be kind of fun.
No, I agree. But that would be perfect. I would welcome a miracle, especially a healing.
Absolutely. Have you seen, this is a little off topic, we'll get back, but you're a nephrologist, so you are dealing with people with kidney issues, and certainly people could die from kidney failure and things like that. Have you ever experienced a healing or something in your practice that you go, there's no other reasonable explanation or materialist explanation for that particular pathology and healing?
Well, I will say at the outset, it doesn't happen nearly as often as I would like, and I think my spiritual gift is probably writing, maybe teaching. I don't think I have the gift of healing. I would love to have it, especially being a doctor. The one case, though, that I really can't explain occurred shortly after I started. Within the first couple of years, I had a patient that was in septic shock. That's where you get an infection that's life-threatening. Blood pressure gets dangerously low. Heart rate tends to get dangerously high. It's about a 50% mortality rate when you're hospitalized with it. So
Wow.
this person, everything, all the systems are failing. The kidneys were failing. That's how I got involved. I did a couple of tests. I don't want to get too technical here, but he was spilling tons of protein in his urine. That means that the filters of the individual kidneys are failing. That number was so high, I didn't believe it, and I rechecked it. And the next number was even higher.
Wow.
So usually in that case, you want to treat with medicines that suppress the immune system, but you couldn't do that because he was already having an infection. It would have been too dangerous. I wanted to get a kidney biopsy, but I couldn't do that because the bone marrow was failing. His platelets were dangerously low. So we were in a lot of trouble. Well, we had him on dialysis for, I think he had it 2 or 3 times, and suddenly his kidneys just started getting better without what would have been adequate treatment. We couldn't do adequate treatment because we couldn't get an actual diagnosis other than it was some kind of what we call glomerulonephritis. That's when the immune system attacks the kidneys. Things started getting better, and he got better just in general. The infection cleared up. He was discharged, and his kidney function had all but recovered. He had a little bit of lost function still, but he was still probably within 5 or 10 points from normal overall percentage points. And I saw him in clinic multiple times, and I said, if I were you, I would testify to your church. I think you had a miracle occur. And now, interestingly enough, about a year after his hospitalization, he came to me, and he did divulge this to me. He said, when everything was going bad in the hospital, I had the chaplain come, and I converted to Christianity and got baptized. So, and that was about the time things started turning around. I was not aware of that until a year after it had happened. And I believed he had underwent a miracle even before I realized that. So that's probably the most interesting case of what I believe was probably a miraculous healing.
Oh, glory be to God. That's great.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think, and by the way, all the different categories you created of the apparitions, I think are very interesting. I think there's 3 that we have to hit on that I'd love a quick overview for everybody watching, but then especially if you would share your favorite case that you recall from it. And I think that's the crisis apparition, of course, the haunting apparition, because I mean, how much of we're in Halloween time, and everybody wants to hear the ghost story. And I personally loved the rescue apparitions as well. So could you give us an overview of those 3 and your favorite case that you studied from them?
So crisis apparitions and
Haunting and
apparition.
rescue.
Oh, and haunting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the crisis apparitions, one important distinction, I talk about seeing what appears to be a spiritual being, an apparition, and people might be saying, well, how do you know that's not a hallucination? How can we be sure to differentiate the two? And one of the best ways you can know that is when there is 2 ways. When there's what I call veridical information, or information that you learn from that apparition that you didn't know otherwise through the normal 5 senses, or when multiple people see the apparition. You can't have a subjective hallucination, at least not one in any kind of detail, between 2 or 3 people, and it have such similar details that the recipients think that they're seeing the same thing. So I think my favorite crisis apparition would be the one that I actually detail in the book, and I use as an object lesson, where, and this was originally written about in Apparitions in Haunted Houses by Sir Ernest Bennett. He wrote that book, I believe it was 1939. There were 3 recipients, 2 ladies, and I believe a gentleman, if I recall. They visited an older man that was sick and spoke to him. He was dying, but he was doing okay at about the time that they saw him. And he said, hey, I haven't seen the doctor in a while. Can you all go and find the doctor and have him come by the house? As they were leaving, they ran across a lake, and they happened to look out on the lake, and it appeared that, well, they saw the apparition of this same dying man floating across the lake in the opposite direction as them. One of them saw it slightly different. One of them saw that he was standing in a boat. The other two thought it was odd that there was no boat, but they just saw him floating across the water in the opposite direction. So they ran into the doctor shortly thereafter and said, hey, and I can't remember off the top of my head, I can't remember his name or if that was even given, but they said, he wants to see you, Doc. Can you go over and take a look at him? He said, well, I was just there. It turns out the doctor was on the way about the same time that the ladies were leaving. He said he passed away. So it turns out he died at about the same time that they saw him floating across the lake. I think that would be my favorite because of the evidential value behind it. 3 different recipients. I think that's really hard to come away with an alternative explanation. And I think fraud is difficult too, because the information was similar enough and they weren't expecting it. I don't think you could say it was a subjective hallucination, but because they admitted there was that one discrepancy, one person saw a boat, the others did not. I think if it were fraud, they more likely would have gotten their stories together and said the same thing. So I think that's my favorite. I think that's my favorite crisis apparition. My favorite rescue.
Before you do rescue, that you brought up a great point that I think needs a little bit of clarification. So,
Right.
how should the average person, when reviewing a story like this, and maybe they're excited to see an apparition, maybe they're excited that they're going to see an angel or a demon or something, paranormal, but yet there really is a methodology that needs to be thought about, right? And that could be mental health. And is this person dealing with DID, like dissociative identity disorder? Are they schizophrenic? And then I think the other side of that, as you hit on, is fraud. Is there a reason that this person could benefit from this story? Are they going to go and write a book? Like there was a case that Lee Strobel wrote about where somebody originally went to heaven, and then many years later, I think he was maybe 12 or something, and then many years later he came back out and said it was a lie, that didn't happen. And so would you agree that there needs to be a methodology that somebody uses to decipher this? And then what would that methodology look like?
Oh, absolutely. I think you have to look at fraud first. I don't think most cases are fraud. I'd guess 5% or fewer are actual fraud. But yeah, look to see if they have an ulterior motive. In chapter 13, I discussed the one case where there's a family that contests a will, and conveniently an apparition occurs that shows one of the sons of the deceased, that where an updated will is, that person goes and gets it, and actually that was taken as authentic for a long time in the world of psychical research. And as it turns out, there was a handwriting specialist that examined the 2 different wills, the original one and this other one that happened to be found, and they found that it was a different signature. So it turns out that was probably a fraud. It's called the Chafin will case. So I look for ulterior motives. And then I'd also want to, then when you get to hallucinations, that question, I'd want to know the circumstances. Hallucinations occur a lot. We've probably all had them, whether we realize it or not, especially when we're in bed, because there's hypnopompic hallucinations and hypnagogic hallucinations. We're prone to hallucinations whenever we first wake up or when we first are drifting into sleep. Did the person wake up paralyzed? That's, so to speak, where they just couldn't move. There's a terrifying phenomenon called sleep paralysis, where people wake up and it's like they see a scary, shadowy figure approaching them. They're scared to death, just this visceral, irrational fear. And it can last seconds or it can last minutes, and then they can move. But if it sounds like sleep paralysis, that may be subjective as well. So if it's in bed, I think, and it's only a one-person sighting, I think you have to consider the fact that it could be hallucinatory. And that's whether you don't have to have a psychiatric disorder to have hallucinations. I know I've had at least an audio hypnopompic hallucination. I thought someone was calling my name just as I was waking up, and it turns out there was nobody in the house. That was probably a hallucination. So I think those are the two that you have to rule out. Then you have to rule out illusion. Is it possible you're mistaking something that's actually there for something else? So when you wake up, do you maybe that hat rack over there looks like a shadowy creature, and then when you adjust your eyes, you find out it's just a hat rack. That kind of thing as well. Is that
Well, you wrote about that case. I think you wrote about a case of the lady that said that she was convinced that there was a ghost, and then she realized that wasn't it through the fire that the shadow was creating something that she was convinced it was, and then she just kept breaking it down and recreating it, and there was a materialist logical explanation for that apparition.
Yes. Yeah, that was a good case, and you wonder people that aren't necessarily going to do that kind of reality checking like she did, going back and forth. That might turn into an apparition story that makes it into a book that really has, as you say, a prosaic explanation.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that that it is that even considering mental health or potential psychiatric disorders could be another uh, solution? Not for everybody, obviously, but I'm sure that could add to the numbers of inauthentic apparitional cases.
I think so, especially if they have schizophrenia, where you can have both visual or auditory hallucinations,
Hmm.
and also neurological issues like Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia. Those folks have hallucinations, subjective hallucinations all the time. If they're in the hospital, if they're on certain medications like pain medications or benzodiazepines, those are anti-anxiety medications. That's a possibility. Or in my world, uremia, that can result in hallucinations as well. That's when your kidneys aren't working and the toxins are building up to a point where you're on the verge of needing dialysis.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. So that's a good explanation. Now, if you'll continue, your favorite rescue apparition, and then your favorite haunting apparition.
I think my favorite rescue apparition was the story about Joshua Slocum, where he was on the ship, and he basically was going on just a really kind of record-breaking journey across the sea. Well, suddenly he got sick. I don't know if it was gastroenteritis or what, or some kind of fever, influenza maybe, but he just got deathly ill, and he was in the middle of a storm on top of everything else, and he just couldn't function. And he would every now and then kind of see out of the corner of his eye, he would see this something at the wheel, at the stern, an apparition, just as if it was just guiding him or guiding the ship at least. And when he woke up the next day, it'd be easy to say, I'm sick. Maybe I was just hallucinating. But somehow through the storm and despite the fact that he wasn't able to control that ship, he was really very close to the same course that he was on before.
Yeah, didn't you say he was only like 3 miles off, and he should have been like 40 or 50 miles off based off of not guiding the ship at all? I mean, it was a very de minimis amount.
Yes, if not shipwrecked or something like that. So, yeah, that, and then Charles Lindbergh also had a similar one as well, where he was flying, where he had his flight, and basically he thought that there were these ghostly figures in the back seat at times. At times when he felt like he's falling asleep and he wasn't going to make it. And that's very common. There's the third man factor, as it was written about, where all these people that are in these dire extreme circumstances, whether they're prisoners of war during 9/11, for instance, people coming out of the buildings trying to escape, it was like they had a guardian angel there trying to guard them, get them out of trouble. But I think the Slocum voyage, that was probably my favorite rescue apparition.
Would it also be a rescue apparition potentially when you hear these stories about uh, kids being able to lift rocks off of their parents that they couldn't possibly have done, or a parent moving a car off of a child? Or would you say that may just be adrenaline? That could just be, or maybe is that a super size scenario? What would you? And I know this is not a real case. I've just heard things like that. Maybe it's all anecdotal, but If you were to hear that, what would you think that would be?
There are cases of super normal displays of strength in the literature. So yeah, I think that's either God temporarily, kind of like Samson giving power, so people can escape a desperate, life threatening situation, or it could be super psi. It could be that somehow that person has unlocked some kind of hidden human potential. I think either one of those would explain it.
So, all right, your favorite haunting, and then we got to go to Super Psi, because I think uh, that was the most unexpected part of, I think, the entire book for me.
Yes. So the favorite haunting I would have to say probably is, and this might be a cliche answer to anyone that's familiar with the literature, but probably the Morton ghost. So back in the 1880s, it's old, but it was very well studied, very well investigated. There was a medical student. It was a young lady named Rosina Despard, and eventually, when this case first came out, she went by Morton as a pseudonym, but then her real name came out. Very odd to have women as medical students back then, but it was she and her household, her family, some of the house servants would see this lady that was draped in black and held a handkerchief up to her face. They would just see her go from the drawing room of their house down the stairs and outside, and you could see her. She would always, when she did appear, and it was at sporadic times, she would traverse this same distance. And I think she was seen at one time by 20 different people, or not at the same time, but she was seen at least by 20 different people at various times. One time, 4 different people saw her in the same trek that she made from the drawing room down to I think it was the garden space outside the house. And it's hard. I think that would be very hard to explain on a purely non-paranormal basis. Yeah, and some people saw her, like Despard, her father would never see the apparition. He was, for whatever reason, wasn't sensitive enough to be able to see the apparition. She would, other members of the house would. The dogs of the house apparently would see her because they would start to growl, and they would go hide under the couch with their tails tucked sometimes. And then there would be other things that are typical of hauntings as well, like doorknobs clanging, raps, hearing things as if they were being dragged outside the room. Just really kind of the typical spooky stuff that you hear about in haunted houses, that would occur as well.
So, I think there's two questions that I know I want the answer to. I'm sure other people are interested in as well. Is okay. So specifically on the haunting stories, uh, when you think of the Morton ghost, and would you be saying, well, I don't see any nefarious intent there. The doorknobs or the bed or whatever noise is being made, and that would be something where you would differentiate and say, well, I think if a demon was doing something, there would absolutely be malicious intent, or I don't think a demon would be in a house like that. I don't think it would. The term in demonology, I think, is infestation. There wouldn't be an infestation of demons. I think this is a wholly separate category. Or would you say, no, actually, I do think there is some negative or some malice there with the haunting stories in particular?
In this particular instance, and probably, I think all of the cases that I either reference or list in the book of hauntings, I think, yeah, I don't think these are demonic. I think somehow a telepathic, and how this works exactly, I don't know, but I think a telepathic impression was somehow left on the house. And I don't believe this is a deceased spirit either. I think it represents somebody maybe that once had lived in that house. And I don't think that this haunting was conscious. A typical haunting, or a haunting apparition more specifically, it tends to be like you're watching a 3-dimensional recording. And that's the case here. And it outside of 1 or 2 cases where Rosina Despard would try to get the apparition's attention and she said there were one or two times it was almost as if the apparition wanted to speak but just couldn't. And also she would try to touch it, but every time she tried to touch the apparition, it would just somehow be just out of touch. You see that in a lot of cases of these apparition studies as well, whether it's hauntings or of the other categories. But I think that was just a three-dimensional recording that somehow imprinted on that house. I don't think it was of a conscious spirit or a demon or an angel.
Well, and one thing that's very interesting about how you spoke about hauntings, and I think this is I'm not a scholar on demonology or angelology, but one thing I think you did exceptionally well is you describing it as a recording. And I never saw, unless I completely missed it, where the apparition takes on a possession of a human, or an oppression of a human, or even an infestation, as we just described. It very much seems like it is a recording, something to your point, and it'll be a good segue into super psi. There is some sort of a recording, a on this area, on this house, whatnot, but it's not directly impacting around, other than it's a little creepy. Again,
Right.
if I was in that spot, it'd be a little creepy. But when we think about, and if you've read literature on possession, or oppression, which I'm sure you have through your research, there are real life consequences happening, to these people, and influences happening. So I think they seem to be two very separate categories.
Yeah, I agree completely, because there is literature on there where people have these experiences, and as you say, there are cases of possession, alleged possession at least. Now that gets us into super psi. That could be an explanation as well if you have a sensitive enough percipient or someone that's around this material when it happens. I believe this is real, though, of course, and at least in some cases. But as we get into super psi, when we consider that, that's when it really becomes murky, and it really becomes more difficult to tease out sometimes.
All right, we got to go to super psi. So give us the definition, your working definition of super psi, and then why is this even broached? Because it's going to sound a little bit on the front end. I'm just going to let everybody know it's going to sound like something you hear in a Marvel movie. But I say that with all respect. I think your concept here is great, but so give the definition, and then explain why you think this is legitimate, and this isn't what we're seeing in the next latest and greatest Hollywood Marvel movie.
Right. So super psi, it's essentially just a dramatic. What it means in the literature, dramatic instances of psi. So psi, as I mentioned earlier, are alleged supernormal capacities that humans have, but we only manage to invoke, usually spontaneously, if at all, during our lifetimes. Things like precognition, telepathy, psychokinesis, etc. So an instance of super psi would just be a dramatic manifestation of that. So let's suppose we're at a seance, and there's a medium that goes into an altered state of consciousness. We're all holding hands around the table. Let's say there's about 10 of us, and suddenly there's a ghost appears. It's transparent at first, then it's fully solid. We can touch it. We can shake hands with it. It imparts knowledge that we couldn't have known otherwise. Maybe it tells us that there's something buried outside the house, some kind of treasure. And this is totally hypothetical scenario.
Totally.
And it knows things about us. The medium, meanwhile, will be able to speak languages that he or she did not know for sure. Just dramatic psi material. So we would think that is either some kind of spirit possession or demonic possession, or it's somehow fraudulent. There's a middle ground there, super psi. Maybe the medium was somehow, and I would argue with the help of the sitters, was able to somehow embrace all this energy to be able to produce all these things, just unlock human potential that we, especially here in the West, unlike most of the rest of the world and throughout most societies in history, we tend to deny occur, but are probably there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So then make your best case. Uh, and again, everybody here knows that I do believe Jesus' resurrection 100% as it is said. But make the case for me that the resurrection, Christ's resurrection, wasn't super psi.
Make the case that Jesus' resurrection was not super psi. Okay.
Correct.
Well, so I would argue,
And that it was a bona fide miracle, right? This is God working outside of the realm, and it wasn't just a series of of apparitions. Or I like how you said, I think you didn't use wizard, but you used like some kind of witch or whatever, that a very powerful witch that planned the whole thing.
sure. Well, first of all, I wouldn't explain the empty tomb. You'd have to say essentially that, okay, in the psychical literature, you have such a thing as apports. Okay, so that is where you have a material. Let's say you have a material, and a lot of times this happens in seances, although it can happen spontaneously. You have an object, say at your house, and you're 5 miles away, and say, there's a little statue of, let's say, of Jesus that I want to appear on the table before me. There are cases.
I got one right there.
Oh, that'd be amazing, actually, if that would work like that. Yeah, that would be. Thanks for making my point there. But let's say that you do that. There are cases in the literature where that has been done. You to explain the empty tomb through super psi, you'd have to argue without trying, because there's no evidence that the disciples believed that Jesus was going to be raised, despite the passion predictions. They didn't at least consciously believe that. You'd have to argue that their unconscious minds, or somebody's unconscious mind, literally apported the body out of the tomb and somewhere else. That's a stretch, even for someone like me that finds super psi to be quite versatile. Also, apparitions tend to have certain characteristics. They tend to be limited, especially the spontaneously occurring ones. Now, ones that occur in seances, that's a little bit of a different story. But ones that occur spontaneously, for instance, very rarely do they say anything. Very rarely do you read of apparitions having conversations. There are very rare exceptions, but very rarely is that the case. Very rarely can apparitions be touched. Again, there are exceptions. Only in 1 or 2 cases am I aware of an apparition that apparently ate food and made it disappear. Very rarely do they make impressions on the environment. Okay, so one of my closing chapters, I say that I ask the question: is Jesus' resurrection essentially apparitions' greatest hits? So,
Yeah.
so one of the crisis apparitions involves a 2-part conversation that one of the percipients had with one of his deceased friends that died during the Transvaal War. That's what I was thinking of. Died during the Transvaal War. That's one of the very rare cases where you actually have an apparition really having any length of a conversation. And yet it doesn't do any of the other strange things. This apparition wasn't touched. It wasn't seen by multiple people, and so forth. So, but Jesus' apparitions, if in fact those are apparitions that we read about in Matthew, Luke, and John, he did have long conversations. A couple of the researchers that I cite say, apparitions don't tend to occur in crowded theaters. They don't tend to occur to more than 8 or 9 people. In terms of secular apparitions that were spontaneous, I think the Samuel Bull apparition I talk about, I believe that was in the haunting section. His apparition appeared to 9 people. Well, Jesus' apparition appeared to 12 people at least, or 11 people at least twice, according to our earliest source, 1 Corinthians 15, and appeared to 500 people, I would argue, spontaneously. This was not facilitated. So it hit that, it checked that box. Jesus, I don't know of any apparition that invited the recipients to touch him, and they were successful. But Jesus' apparition did, if we want to explain it as an apparition. Jesus ate food.
And he cooked fish. Not only did he eat the fish and eat bread, he also even cooked the fish, which is pretty cool if you think about that. And probably inconsistent with apparitions, that are, maybe a really good chef apparition. That would probably be an okay one, but.
Correct. You have to take basically about 140 years of psychical research that encompasses tens of thousands of pages of material and cases, that has apparitions of varying qualities of evidence. And you'd have to take the best cases of about 7 different phenomena and put it together to come up with the kinds of to match the appearances of Jesus in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
That really, I guess, from a purely statistical standpoint, that it's almost impossible that all those would have occurred. And I'd throw in that they only had, what, if we take Luke's timeline as historical, they only had about 40 days to do it. This remarkable compendium of appearances. That is with the exception of what happened to Paul, which was probably 1.5 to 3.5 years later.
Yeah, and you look at the mathematical probability of that, and then you also would need to add in the probability of Jesus fulfilling over 300 miracles, and you start thinking about that on the front end of his life, and then I mean it becomes, again, it doesn't make any sense. It starts going into mathematically impossible.
Agreed. Would you throw in fulfilled prophecy? Now that's another difficult subject, but I do believe that there are passages in the Old Testament which prefigure Christ quite well, especially some of the lengthier passages, like the 53rd chapter of Isaiah.
Isaiah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I know our Jewish friends believe that was talking about Israel, and I don't want to get off into prophecy, but that's a conversation piece. And then you talk about like the trilemma. Jesus claimed to be that he was divine in some sense. I know of no scholars, too many well-learned people who would argue that Jesus was fraudulent or that he was delusional. They would usually, if you're a critical scholar, you try to deny that he ever made such claims to begin with, but yet there's very impressive evidence that he did. So what do you do with that? It gets us back to C.S. Lewis's trilemma. So you're right, when you put it all together, not to mention what I would argue the solid evidence that the Old Testament was inspired. That's a pretty good set of arguments for the reality of the Judeo-Christian traditions.
So what would you say to somebody that goes, okay, Jonathan, you're obviously incredibly brilliant and well-read, but this all feels really new agey. Electromagnetism, super psi and energies and apparitions. What would you say to them about that, especially if they're another believer?
You mean the evidence for apparitions, and it sounds new agey?
Yes, exactly. And that we are classifying them, or telekinesis, makes me think of like the crystal ball and all this kind of soothsaying. What would you say to them that what you're doing isn't aberrant to theology? You're not obviously not welcoming in, or demonic and Satan and all this, but that you're really trying to understand human flourishing and some aspects of our brain, some aspects of what God has built us without actually with very little knowledge globally. I mean, I think about how much we know about a kidney. We know a lot about a kidney at this point. Sure. We don't know a lot about truly what God has given us from a psychological or psychical perspective, just because it's been pretty untouched overall.
Right. Some of it might sound new agey, but be that as it may, the evidence seems to warrant that. I would package it within a different framework. When you put all this together, imagine somebody that, instead of these spontaneous occurrences that seem to happen to some people, that tend to not be deliberate, and even when they are, even your most gifted mediums, for instance, they have to have a really good day to be able to produce some of the most impressive things. And even then they have limitations. But imagine someone that can, at will, all the time, and with no limitations in magnitude. Imagine that same person being able to have total control and telepathy. You can make anyone think what they want at any time. You can make them see an apparition through telepathy. You can influence matter, kind of like what Magneto does when you talk about Marvel. Although he had to use electromagnetism, you're not really limited to that with psychokinesis. You can see the future. You can see at any point in the past. Basically, that person's more powerful than Superman, right? That person could take over the world if he or she was the only one that had that power. It'd be kind of like Charles Fort's wild talents, if you could realize that. And what that strikes me as, and this might be a category error, perhaps you achieve something like that when you get the resurrection body. Maybe we get that deposit now. And I'd also argue they're spiritual gifts. I think the Holy Spirit does give people the gift of healing. And I think telepathy, they might go by different words in the New Testament, or what we use in modern Christian parlance, but I think that's used. Speaking other languages, well, we hear a lot about that within charismatic versions of Christianity. So there's no reason that as a gift of the Holy Spirit, you couldn't do that now. But I wonder when you get that, what my thought is, when you get that full deposit of the Holy Spirit, you're truly made into your glorified resurrection body, the same kind that Jesus has. It may look a lot like what we imagine as the apogee of having all these psi abilities. And so, well, I think a lot of people doing New Age things, they are able to some degree harness these abilities. I think it works within a Judeo-Christian framework as well.
I also think especially for the New Age argument, to me, it seems like for those of us that know Jesus and have a faith, there is certainly a desire to unlock whatever God has designed us to do and to use that for the kingdom. I think when we look at the New Age, there's a lot of people that do have that Christ-shaped void in their heart. They haven't given it to God yet. And so in their world, they are trying to figure out all of this stuff, the gnosis, right? The secret knowledge, the esoteric knowledge, because they haven't filled that void with Christ. And so they want to be godlike, right? They want to have these, and not to grow the kingdom, but for their own, their own purposes. So I could see a distinction there of man, it'd be great to be able to tap into healing. And man, then you could do the thing that a lot of the discernment ministries dog, a lot of the demon slayer ministries, or if you want to call them a ministry, for about like, then just go into a kid's hospital and start healing, right? I mean, who wouldn't love to be able to do that and help kids that have cancer and whatnot? So I could see how there is a distinction there between the two.
Yeah, and you've hit on something that's one of my pet peeves of the modern church. I think one of the reasons we're losing, or seem to be losing, the youths. I think something like what I've seen different surveys say, something like 60 to 70% of youths, they go off to college and they lose their faith. And there might be, they don't come back to the church. And there might be numerous reasons for that. I think one reason is there's a dearth of spirituality. We teach Christianity as too much of a religion, about checking boxes. Go to church on Sunday, check that box. Go to church on Wednesday night, well, that's bonus points, and so forth. Say so many prayers. And I think Jesus made it clear that all those things are great, but they have to be done with the right sincerity. God actually wants your devotion. We've taken the spirituality out of it. And I think that's a big problem. So people seek it elsewhere. They go into spiritism. They go into other different forms of belief where they fully will go after they'll want to commune with other spirits, other entities. I would tell these folks, you know what? I'm every bit the spiritist you are, but I go straight to the source, to the transcendent, uncreated, creative force of the universe. I have the Holy Spirit. That's my spiritualism. I don't have any need for any lesser entities than that. So
absolutely,
come join me, come try it out. That would be my
Amen.
For those people.
And I have that stat actually for you in a book. Only 43% of U.S. adults in America identify as Protestant, which is down from 51% in 2009. 1 in 5 adults are Catholic, down from 23% in 2009. And atheists are up from 4%, from 2% to 4%. Agnostics are up from 5% from 3%, and now 17% of Americans, up from 12%, say they're nothing in particular. So your statistics are pretty on par. All right, one more question because I know you got to get going. Um, if you are uh, if you are interested in this space, because you just find it interesting, because you feel like it will help you draw closer to Jesus. Maybe you don't know Jesus yet, but seeing a believer like you, it looks like it's even substantiated your faith. What is the safe way to study, to research, to understand this without going into occultism, without going into a spot where you don't want to be? That you've clearly had to navigate this throughout the process. So what would be your advice to that person?
Well, that's a really good question, because I had a good one of my friends who's very knowledgeable about New Testament scholarship, and he basically told me, you got to be careful. And it took me a while to really realize what he was talking about. And I think after talking to him a little bit more and understanding what he was saying, he said the temptation in reading all this is to go out and try it yourself, the occult. I think you probably shouldn't enter into this field of inquiry unless you're very well grounded, you know what you believe, and you should do it very prayerfully. You should probably pray really anytime before, because I can tell you, as I had written to some degree in the acknowledgments, this really created a metaphysical crisis for me. All this stuff. How do I fit this within a Judeo-Christian worldview? So it's very and I still don't know how to fit all of it, especially some of the things we haven't really talked about. So you just have to be very well grounded. And if you have any interest in participating in the occult, I will tell you, my knowledge of this that I've gained, it's made me steer even more, want to steer clear of it. But maybe some people don't feel that way. Just be very well grounded, very mature in your beliefs, know what you believe and why you believe it. And if you're a Christian like me, then or even if you're not, frankly, pray to God for guidance.
That's great advice, and I would actually take that even further. Jonathan's being nice. I through all of the work that I've done in my multiple masters in this, I can't even. Not only do I pray before, I try to pray after. And if you don't feel a little scared, a little disgusted, a little through these process, a little in crisis, then I would say this is probably not a good field to be researching. There were many times that I had to put it down and just walk away because I'm like, this is a lot. And a lot of the time, my next prayer to God is, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want me to be? This seems like you could find somebody better that could understand this. This is hard. This is a hard thing. Your book isn't. Let me just caution everybody. Your book isn't scary, but it is. There are certainly a lot of books on demonology or angelology. Angelology is reverential fear. Demonology is just scary. But your book but I would still say it's intense. It's an intense book. It's a wonderful book, but an intense book because it hits you that the world, that there are both multiple worlds. There's the one we live in, the temporal world. There is a spiritual world, and there's so much even within that dimensionality that we don't understand. And that can create a real a crisis of identity if you're not rooted in the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and I pray. I try to pray this every night. I'll even use these words, Ephesians style. Put that armor around me, God. Protect this house. Protect my family. Because when you get into this stuff, what hits you too is you're like, you hear about the Sunday school and you read stories in the New Testament about the miracles and Jesus exorcising demons, but you hit this and it's like, here and today, this stuff is real. And people that really, the other aspect of this we haven't talked about, people that study the paranormal, and it seems to be, well, let's just say paranormal. I don't want to get more specific than that. But if you participate, yeah, you're in it. You're really asking for trouble. But sometimes even studying it, you're kind of inviting preternatural entities into the equation to some extent. So you need to have a really good prayer canopy. It's this. I don't sleep well as it is, and this hasn't done wonders for my sleep. I've kind of 2 or 3 years ago, if we'd had this conversation, I'd tell you I've really lost sleep over this. So this isn't for everybody. Maybe if you have any doubts, you probably shouldn't read my book. Probably shouldn't really go into this area of inquiry if you don't want to be challenged both metaphysically and in other ways.
And I would also encourage people when they're reading your book to read it slowly, because you share a whole lot of new nomenclature for people that they may not have heard or read previously.
Sure.
That and it is readable, but it's one that if you're just going fast through it and not really digesting it, I think the information could get conflated very easily. And you've done such a wonderful job of parsing it out where people can understand and ascertain this is a crisis apparition. This is an apparition of the living. This is a haunting. This is a rescue. And being able to really, understand at a clear level.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, and I felt like these apparitions pretty fit relatively, not totally cleanly into these categories, like the Samuel Bull apparition that we didn't talk about. You could potentially call that a reunion apparition since he'd appeared to family, whereas hauntings are usually of unrecognized figures. But it kind of took on more of that recording style, like a haunting, like an unconscious, like whatever this apparition was very unconscious. So they don't fit neatly across those categories, but I think they fit well enough.
Absolutely. Well, we've already gone over the time, but hopefully we'll have you back on, Jonathan, if you'll grace us with your presence again, because there's just so much in this book, and usually we end up having people watch this and sending a lot of questions in, and this is so outside of my realm of, well, whatever expertise the Lord has given me, that I think we're gonna have to have you come back on and explain, because it's so good.
Well, if you don't mind me doing another shameless advertisement here, I will say
Please do.
I've got another book coming out next July. It's on UFOs, and I go even deeper down the rabbit hole on that one. That one is a little bit scarier than this one. This one is.
All right. Well, then you and I are gonna have to circle back up, because we're gonna have to start. We're gonna have to talk about that, and then I think within even maybe next time we'll have to go through more super psi, and maybe even break down 3 or 4 more apparitions, because I think I have a lot of additional questions on the Marian apparitions and the transitional apparitions. So, but we appreciate your time so much today. It was awesome, and we'll be sure to follow up with you soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on, and I will be happy to come back. Just let me know.
All right, I love it. All right, thanks, Jonathan. Have a great day.
All right, you too.